Imagine standing on a cliff at the edge of Europe in the year 1400. Before you stretches an endless ocean, dark and mysterious, its waves crashing against the rocks as though guarding secrets no man has yet seen. For centuries, people believed that beyond those waters lay only monsters, endless storms, or perhaps the very edge of the world where ships would tumble into the abyss. Yet in the hearts of men and women of this age, a restlessness stirred. It was the yearning to go further, to push past the boundaries of the known, to discover what lay beyond the horizon. This restless spirit, combined with ambition, greed, faith, and curiosity, would ignite one of the most transformative periods in human history, the Age of Discovery. This was not just an age of ships and sailors, but an age where the world itself seemed to grow larger with every passing decade. New lands were sighted, vast oceans were crossed, maps were redrawn, and old certainties were shattered. The Age of Discovery was, at its heart, a story of courage and risk, but also of conquest and exploitation. It brought people into contact, who had never before dreamed of one another's existence, forever binding together continents that had been isolated for millennia. And it all began with a question that has driven humanity since the dawn of time. What lies beyond? In the early 15th century, Europe was emerging from the shadows of the Middle Ages. The Renaissance was beginning to flourish, sparking new ideas in art, science, and learning. Trade routes connected the East and West, but they were dangerous, slow, and often controlled by middlemen. Spices, silks, and precious goods from Asia were in high demand in European markets, but to obtain them meant passing through a chain of traders and empires that stretched across the Middle East and Central Asia. Every link in that chain added cost and risk. European kingdoms dreamed of breaking free from this reliance, of finding a direct path to the riches of the East. And so, eyes turned to the sea. Portugal was the first to lead. A small kingdom on the edge of Europe, it looked outward to the Atlantic. Its ruler, Prince Henry, known to history as Henry the Navigator, became the patron of exploration. Though he himself never voyaged across oceans, he sponsored countless expeditions along the coast of Africa. He established a school of navigation where sailors studied the stars, the winds, and the newly improved compass. Under his guidance, Portuguese ships pushed further south, mapping coastlines unknown to Europeans and opening the way to the riches of Africa's gold and ivory. By the late 15th century, Portuguese sailors had rounded the southern tip of Africa. The fearsome Cape of Good Hope and opened a sea route to India. Vasco da Gama's arrival in Calicut in 1498 was a thunderclap in history. At last, the dream of reaching Asia by sea had been fulfilled. The spices, gems, and textiles of the East could now flow directly into Portuguese ports, bypassing centuries-old trade routes. This breakthrough would make Portugal for a time one of the richest and most powerful nations on earth. But Portugal was not alone in this race. Its Iberian rival, Spain, hungered for its own path to glory. And here enters one of the most famous and controversial figures of the Age of Discovery, Christopher Columbus. Convinced that Asia could be reached by sailing west across the Atlantic, Columbus sought support for his bold plan. After years of rejection, the Catholic monarchs of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, finally agreed to back him. In 1492, Columbus set sail with 3 small ships, driven by faith and determination. When he landed on islands in the Caribbean, he believed he had reached Asia. In truth, he had stumbled upon lands entirely unknown to Europeans, lands that would transform the destiny of the world. Columbus's voyages opened the gateway for Spain's vast empire in the Americas. Soon, conquistadors followed, men like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, who with small armies and ruthless ambition toppled the mighty empires of the Aztecs and the Incas. The treasures of the New World, gold, silver, and fertile lands, poured into Spain, fueling its rise as a superpower. Yet these conquests came at a devastating cost. Native populations who had lived on these lands for countless generations faced disease, enslavement, and destruction on an unimaginable scale. For them, the Age of Discovery was not a story of opportunity, but of catastrophe. Still, the tide of exploration could not be stopped. Soon, other European powers joined the race. England, France, and the Netherlands sent their own explorers westward. John Cabot sailed under the English flag, seeking northern routes across the Atlantic. Jacques Cartier of France mapped parts of Canada. The Dutch skilled seafarers carved out their own routes to Asia, challenging Portuguese control. The seas became highways of competition, filled with ambition and bloodshed. Yet this age was not only about conquest and empire, it was also about connection. Plants, animals, goods, and ideas began to cross oceans in what historians call the Columbian Exchange. Potatoes, tomatoes, and maize from the Americas transformed diets in Europe and Asia. Horses and cattle, brought by Europeans, reshaped life in the New World. Diseases spread too, with tragic consequences, but the exchange of life itself marked a profound moment in human history. The world was no longer divided into isolated continents. It was becoming a single, interconnected web. Behind the sails and cannons, there were human stories. Sailors braving uncharted waters, merchants risking fortunes, and indigenous people, facing worlds they had never imagined. The age of discovery was filled with triumphs and tragedies, heroes and villains, visionaries and opportunists. It was an age where courage and cruelty walked hand in hand, leaving a legacy that still echoes today. And as the 15th century gave way to the 16th, the world seemed both larger and smaller at once. Larger, because new lands and peoples had been revealed. Smaller, because oceans no longer divided but connected. The maps of the old world were being torn apart and redrawn, and humanity was entering a new era of global exchange. The age of discovery had begun, and it would change everything. By the dawn of the 16th century, the age of discovery was no longer just a gamble of brave adventurers. It had become a fierce contest of empires. The oceans, once feared as barriers, were now highways of ambition. European powers looked outward, their sails stretching across every horizon, their eyes fixed not only on wealth but on dominance. The world was being carved up piece by piece into spheres of influence as kingdoms scrambled to claim what they believed was theirs by right of discovery. In 1494, just 2 years after Columbus's first voyage, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas. With the blessing of the Pope, they divided the globe between them with an invisible line across the Atlantic. Lands to the east would belong to Portugal, while those to the west would fall to Spain. It was a bold, almost arrogant move, two kingdoms claiming authority over a world they had barely glimpsed. Yet this treaty shaped centuries of history, granting Portugal, Brazil, and South America, while Spain took nearly all the rest of the Americas. Portugal, though small in size, was relentless in its expansion. Its explorers pressed deeper into the Indian Ocean, establishing trading posts in Goa, Malacca, and along the coasts of Africa. In 1511, they captured Malacca, the gateway to the Spice Islands, and soon Portuguese ships reached as far as China and Japan. They did not seek vast colonies like Spain, but rather fortified trading outposts that gave them control over the flow of goods, spices, silks, and porcelain between east and west. For a time, their network was unmatched, a web of commerce, stretching from Lisbon to Nagasaki. Spain, on the other hand, built an empire of land and people. The Americas became its treasure chest. In 1519, Ferdinand Magellan, sailing under the Spanish crown, embarked on a voyage that would prove humanity's boldest journey yet. His goal was to find a westward route to the Spice Islands. Magellan's fleet crossed the Atlantic, navigated the treacherous straits at the tip of South America, and sailed into the vast unknown of the Pacific Ocean. For months, the men endured hunger and despair, believing the sea would never end. Magellan himself would die in battle in the Philippines, but one of his ships, the Victoria, returned to Spain in 1522. It carried only 18 survivors out of the hundreds who had set sail, but it had completed the first circumnavigation of the globe. Humanity had at last sailed all the way around the Earth. The world was no longer an abstract idea. It was a tangible sphere, vast but connected. The consequences of these discoveries were staggering. Wealth flooded into Europe. Spanish galleons carried silver from the mines of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia, so much that it reshaped global economies. Entire cities in Spain glittered with New World riches. Yet this silver also fueled inflation, destabilizing economies and sparking conflicts that spread across Europe. The wealth of discovery was both a blessing and a burden. At the same time, the age of discovery brought with it an invisible passenger: disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza ravaged the native populations of the Americas. Civilizations that had flourished for centuries collapsed in mere decades as millions perished. Entire cultures were nearly erased. For the indigenous peoples, the arrival of Europeans was not an age of discovery, but an age of loss, of suffering, and of forced transformation. But the tide of exchange flowed both ways. The Columbian Exchange, as it is often called, reshaped not only diets but entire societies. Potatoes and maize spread to Europe, Africa, and Asia, fueling population growth. In Ireland, the humble potato became a staple that sustained generations. In China, sweet potatoes and maize allowed farming to flourish in regions where rice could not grow. Meanwhile, sugarcane brought to the Americas became the backbone of brutal plantation economies. Its cultivation demanded immense labor, and when native populations could no longer meet that demand, Europeans turned to Africa. Thus began one of the darkest chapters in this era, the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were captured, sold, and transported across the Atlantic in horrific conditions, forced to work in plantations that enriched European empires. Families were torn apart, cultures devastated, and generations condemned to lives of bondage. The Age of Discovery, while celebrated for its daring voyages, was also built upon human suffering and exploitation on a scale the world had never seen. The legacy of that trade still echoes painfully through history, shaping societies even today. Meanwhile, other European powers were rising to challenge Spain and Portugal. The Dutch, armed with powerful fleets and driven by mercantile ambition, created the Dutch East India Company, one of the first multinational corporations. Their ships sailed to Indonesia, where they seized control of the spice trade. They built colonies in South Africa, the Caribbean, and even in North America, founding New Amsterdam, later known as New York. The Dutch Empire was a merchant empire, guided by profit but underpinned by naval might. England, too, began to flex its power on the seas. In the late 16th century, figures like Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe, plundering Spanish ships and bringing riches back to England. Queen Elizabeth II's England was becoming a maritime nation, and with the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, it signaled that Spain's dominance could be challenged. Soon, English settlers crossed the Atlantic, founding colonies in Virginia and Massachusetts. What began as fragile settlements would, in time, grow into a powerful nation of their own. France, not to be outdone, sought opportunities in the New World. French explorers such as Samuel de Champlain established footholds in Canada, while traders ventured deep into North America, forging alliances with indigenous peoples in the fur trade. Though smaller in scale, France's empire laid foundations that would shape the continent's history for centuries. As these powers expanded, maps were redrawn again and again. Oceans became less mysterious, coastlines more familiar, yet the drive for discovery never waned. New routes were sought, new lands claimed, and new peoples encountered. For Europe, this was a golden age of exploration and expansion. For much of the rest of the world, it was a time of upheaval, conquest, and profound change. What makes this era so compelling is not only the vastness of what was achieved, but the contradictions within it. It was an age of brilliance and brutality, of knowledge gained and innocence lost. The world was opened, but often by force. Trade brought prosperity, but it was often built on the backs of the enslaved. Curiosity drove men across oceans, but so did greed. It is this duality, the light and the shadow, that defines the Age of Discovery. By the early 17th century, the balance of power had shifted. Portugal and Spain, once unrivaled, were fading. Their empires, though vast, were difficult to control and costly to maintain. The Dutch, English, and French pressed harder, their colonies spreading across the globe. The race for discovery had become the race for empire, and the story of exploration was merging with the story of colonization. Yet at its heart, this age still carried that original spark, the desire to know what lay beyond. Sailors risked storms and starvation, merchants risked fortune, and missionaries carried their faith into distant lands. Knowledge expanded as much as territory. Maps grew more accurate, and new scientific observations began to challenge old beliefs about the Earth, the heavens, and humanity itself. The age of discovery was laying the foundations not just of empires, but of modern science and global awareness. The seas that once divided civilizations had become the arteries of a new world system. The world was now in motion, its peoples, goods and ideas flowing in currents that would never again be reversed. The age of discovery was entering its maturity, and the consequences of its vast transformations were only beginning to unfold. As the 17th and 18th centuries unfolded, the age of discovery entered its later phase, one no longer marked by daring voyages into unknown seas, but by the steady tightening of Europe's grip on the globe. The world was mapped more fully now. The great mysteries of distant continents had been unveiled, their coastlines traced, their resources noted, and their peoples encountered. What began as exploration had evolved into colonization, and what started as curiosity had hardened into empire. The Dutch continued to dominate Asian trade routes, their powerful East India Company wielding authority not only as a trading organization, but as a quasi-government with the ability to wage war, negotiate treaties, and establish settlements. They seized control of the Spice Islands, driving out rivals, and transformed Amsterdam into one of the richest cities in Europe. In their wake, the English East India Company rose to prominence. At first, its footholds in India were fragile, outposts, small factories nestled along the coast. But over time, these outposts grew into strongholds, and the company became an empire within an empire, its influence stretching across the Indian subcontinent. In the Americas, Spain's dominance began to wane. Its vast flow of silver, once a blessing, had destabilized its economy and fueled endless wars in Europe. The colonies themselves, though rich in resources, became increasingly difficult to govern across such distances. Meanwhile, new challengers emerged. The English carved out 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard of North America, communities that would grow in independence and ambition. The French pressed into the interior, claiming Canada and the Mississippi Valley. The Caribbean islands became some of the most contested territories on Earth, fought over for their sugar, a commodity so lucrative that wars were waged to control it. The human cost of this expansion was immense. The slave trade reached its peak during these centuries, as millions of Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. Packed into ships in horrific conditions, many never survived the voyage. Those who did were forced into brutal labor. On plantations in the Americas, their lives consumed to fuel the insatiable European demand for sugar, tobacco, and cotton. This trade, triangular in its roots, connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a grim cycle of exploitation. It was discovery transformed into a machinery of profit, a global system built on suffering. And yet, even amidst this darkness, the world was also becoming more connected in ways that shaped modern life. Goods that had once been luxuries became commonplace. Coffee from Ethiopia, tea from China, and chocolate from the Americas became daily habits in European cities. New tastes changed not just diets but cultures. Cafes and coffeehouses became centers of discussion and debate, fueling the intellectual movements that would later give rise to revolutions. Global trade did not only enrich kings and merchants, it altered how ordinary people lived, what they ate, and how they saw the world. Science, too, was transformed by the age of discovery. The careful mapping of the seas, the observation of stars, and the collection of plants and animals from distant lands all contributed to a new understanding of nature. Naturalists traveled alongside explorers, gathering specimens that filled the cabinets of curiosity in European palaces and universities. The voyages of Captain James Cook in the 18th century exemplified this shift. Cook not only charted vast portions of the Pacific from Australia to Hawaii, but also carried with him scientists like Joseph Banks, who documented the flora and fauna of these new lands. Exploration was no longer only about empire, it was also about knowledge, about uncovering the patterns of the natural world. The Enlightenment, that great age of reason, was deeply shaped by this era of discovery. Philosophers and thinkers, from Montesquieu to Voltaire, reflected on the encounters between civilizations. Some admired the perceived simplicity of indigenous societies, contrasting it with the corruption of Europe. Others used the diversity of cultures to argue for universal principles of human rights. The age of discovery had expanded not just maps but minds, challenging old certainties and opening new debates about humanity itself. Yet behind every intellectual advance, the reality of conquest remained. The indigenous peoples of the Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific bore the weight of European expansion. Lands were taken, traditions disrupted, and lives lost in the name of discovery. The age of discovery was not experienced equally. For some, it meant wealth, progress, and opportunity. For others, it meant loss, destruction, and enslavement. This contrast is essential to understanding its legacy. By the end of the 18th century, the world was fully enmeshed in global exchange. Empires spanned continents. Ships crisscrossed oceans with predictable regularity. The age of exploration, in its purest sense, was drawing to. The age of discovery changed the trajectory of humanity forever. It connected worlds that had been isolated, weaving them into a single global fabric. It brought about unimaginable wealth and devastating suffering. It introduced new foods, new ideas, new technologies, and new diseases. It reshaped economies, fueled revolutions, and laid the groundwork for the modern world system. It was a paradox, an age of wonder and of horror, of brilliance and of brutality. And when we look back on it today, we must hold both truths at once. We cannot celebrate the courage of sailors who braved uncharted waters without remembering the countless lives uprooted and destroyed by conquest. We cannot admire the daring of Columbus, Gama, or Magellan without acknowledging the devastation their voyages unleashed on native peoples. To understand the age of discovery is to see it in its entirety, a story of humanity at its most ambitious and at its most ruthless. Yet there is also something deeply human in this age. At its core was the desire to know, to push beyond the horizon, to refuse to accept the limits of the known world. That spirit, for better or worse, is part of us still. Every time we launch a spacecraft into the unknown, every time we dive into the depths of the ocean, every time we look for answers in places untouched, we echo the same restless yearning that once drove ships out of Lisbon, Seville, and Amsterdam. Discovery, in all its beauty and in all its danger, remains at the heart of who we are. And so, as we close the story of the age of discovery, we are left with a reflection. The world we live in today, with its global trade, its mingling of cultures, its interconnectedness of economies and ideas, was born in those centuries of exploration. The promises and the perils of globalization trace their roots back to that era when the first sails appeared on distant horizons. We are heirs to both the marvel and the tragedy of that age. The age of discovery was not just a chapter in history, it was the opening act of the modern world. It showed us the possibilities of connection, but also the costs of ambition unchecked. It reminds us that discovery is never neutral. It carries consequences, shaping lives in ways both profound and permanent. As we look to our own future, exploring not only the Earth but the stars, we must ask ourselves, what will we carry forward from this legacy? Will we repeat its mistakes or will we learn from its lessons? Will our own age of discovery be one of exploitation or of understanding? The answers will be written by us in the centuries to come. The seas of history remind us that every horizon crossed changes the world forever, and the age of discovery, with all its triumphs and tragedies, is the proof of that truth. If you found this journey through history meaningful, don't forget to support the channel. Like the video, share it with others who love exploring the past, and subscribe for more stories that dive deep into the events that shaped our world. Together, let's keep the spirit of discovery alive, not to conquer, but to understand.